I'm sure you have questions about this. And so what I'm going to do is open it up for questions. But before I do, I want to give you some insight into what these LOI actually look like. And to do that, I'm going to escape from this for a moment. And we're going to go into these two documents here, which are in effect a template for the two different LOIs, the two different letters of intent. This one here has to do with the buying company, BuyCo. This one here has to do with how BuyCo gets funded. So this is the invitation or the letter of intent that spells out the terms of the subscription agreement that will exist between the seller and BuyCo. And this agreement is the one, or this letter of intent will be the form of the definitive purchase agreement that it will exist between the seller and the BuyCo, the buyer. So in here is all of your items like total purchase price. In here, you'll see a few little wrinkles like payment of $5,000,003 will be payable upon the closing. Why not the $5,450,000? We hold $150,000 back. And the reason we do that is just to make sure in case there are any things that get adjusted, because after the closing, certain things are discovered that were supposed to be true one way and they weren't. So you can make an adjustment, and then any adjustments come out of that 150, and any adjustments that aren't needed, of course, the money then goes to the seller at the end of 180 days. And it's a small amount. It's just designed to cover little piddly stuff that can easily fall through cracks. So still your total purchase price. And then in here is also the date of your closing. All the other things that go into these letters of intent are in here. It's signed, and everybody is in agreement as to what the basic terms of the deal are. And then what happens is this letter of intent parallels this letter of intent in that it mimics the date of closing, the contingency cutoff date, the date by which it has to be signed or it's void. Everything that sets up the terms of this document is reflected over here so that this document, when it's finally drawn, the subscription agreement, cannot close unless the purchase agreement closes. The purchase agreement cannot close unless the subscription agreement closes, and it sets forth that they both close simultaneously. Now, who sees everything that happens from this agreement? The seller is going to see it. You're going to see it. That's it. The only people who see everything, the only people who see everything on this side are you and the seller. On this side, the people who see this side of the agreement are all of your finance people see this side. They do not see this side. So this side is where the phantom or the stealth comes in, because to everyone on this side of the transaction, except for you and the seller, to everyone, the buyer is coming into this deal with $1.5 million in cash. Okay. So it's really important that conceptually that you see that. Now, another point that I'd like to make, most of the folks that are on this particular webinar today are with us through our Essentials program. And so we've just introduced you to an advanced form of double escrow technique, very viable, very usable today. To our pro people, as we give a higher level of support, and to our pro people, there's a library in which you'll be able to access these template documents so that you are spared the time and perhaps the expense of having to get these type of documents drawn up. And of course, we follow that through down to template definitive agreements and template subscription agreements so that it really tends to cut down legal expenses when it comes time to get these agreements actually drawn up, because it's a map for your attorney to follow. We never recommend that you do them without an attorney working with you unless you're very advanced, unless you've done a number of these. And because you've paid your legal tuition by actually working with attorneys to get deals done, at some point you are qualified, at least semi-qualified, to do these agreements on your own. But certainly for the first couple, you're going to want to have an attorney at your side who this is what they do. They do acquisition type legal work. Let me go back to the illustration and let me open up the line for questions and see who has a question. Ooh, I see lots of questions popping up there. So let's start with this one here. First question was, how can we get template of LOIs? If you're pro, just send me an email and we'll get them to you. Eventually, they're going to be on the website and you'll just be able to download them. But this is hot off the press, so they're not on the website yet. So you just send me an email and we'll take care of it. Thank you. I'm in both Essentials and Pro. Everybody that's in Pro really went through Essentials. Question. Banks want to see seasoned cash. How do you satisfy the bank's request to see the cash seasoned? It depends on the word season. When you form a BuyCo, nobody expects to see seasoned cash because BuyCo is created for the purchase. That's why the company exists. All the money coming into BuyCo will be new money. And I've yet to have any bank say to us, but has to be money that you can show me the history of the money. How do you get the seller to give you his company's money for an extended period of time? It's not an extended period of time. Your buyback of the seller's shares of BICO are no different than if you had given him a note. So whatever you would have given him a note for on $1.5 million, for example, let's say that was going to be the seller's note portion and you were going to pay back $500,000 a year for 3 years. You're still going to do the same thing. Whatever you would have paid in interest, you build into what your buyback is. So you're not going to call it interest. You're just going to call it, maybe the buyback is for $1.6 million or $1.7 million, but spaced over the 3 years. And so whatever you would have done in a note, you're just doing in your buyback of the seller's shares. So that's basically how you do that. And you just have to make sure that the cash flow in the company is going to sustain that. If the cash flow is not going to sustain that, then you shouldn't have done the deal, whether it's a note or a rollback. You shouldn't have done it either way. If your cash flow isn't going to work, then that's not a doable deal. So nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from our traditional structure except the mechanics and the instruments by which we're doing it. It's essentially the same thing, but the instruments and the methodology here are important. Won't the bank simply see on the source of funds statement that the money came from the seller and not the buyer? No, because the lenders don't see the second escrow. They don't see it. What they see is the escrow on their side, and it is the buyer's money. It's BICO cash coming from BICO. That's what it is. So the source of the money is BICO in terms of what comes into that first escrow. From working with banks, it seems they want to know where the cash came from and what the terms and parties to the agreement were. They're going to be looking at escrow one. They're going to be looking at BICO. They're going to be looking at BICO is the buyer. They're going to be looking at funds from BICO. I, again, have yet to have a bank go past BICO and say, where did these funds come from? The cash is real in the sense that it is BICO's real cash. The mechanics of how we got it there, it's a little subterranean, but it's BICO's cash. Also, generally, we don't do these mezzanine loans with banks. We do them with companies that do mezzanine loan funding. And maybe the word banks is what's putting people into some degree of question, because when they've dealt with banks, had a lot of rules and regulations that they have to comply with. Mezzanine lenders aren't that. Mezzanine lenders have a totally different profit perspective, which makes them a little bit less of an advisor than a bank would be. Let me give you an example. People invest into mezzanine lending funds. Those funds don't charge bank rates. Let's say that you went to a bank to get a loan. They might charge you 4 or 5% today's money market. That mezzanine lender is going to charge you 7, 8, maybe 9%. If the deal is really risky in the way they see it, they might charge you 10 or 12%. And whatever interest they charge you, they're going to ask for warrants in BICO. They're going to ask for cashless warrants. And what those are is the warrant give them the opportunity to buy 5 or 10% of BICO for nothing. In other words, they don't put up any money. And when they exercise them, they get 5 or 10% of BICO. And they do that because then you'll buy them back from them at a somewhat market price for their share of the company. So this is an equity high interest play for a mezzanine lender. So you're not dealing with the same level of scrutiny that you might deal with at the bank. They know they're taking more risk just by the nature of their types of loans, and their rules are different. Now, why is this important? Because it opens up a whole new source of funding for you instead of going to a bank. The second thing is that if you look at the way that these loans are structured, it compels you to buy a profitable company. In other words, a lot of times people bring deals to us and the companies are very marginal. They're $1 million, $2 million in sales. They're making $150,000, $200,000 in profit after paying the seller a salary for the work he does there. And then you start to look at the purchase price and the cash flows of the company, and nothing makes sense. We're not showing you this so you can buy those kind of companies. We're showing you this so you can go out and buy a $10 million a year, $20, $50 million a year business that makes 12, 15% EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. In other words, true cash flow makes 10, 15% minimum on its sales, where you're going to buy this company for 4 times EBITDA so that the cash flows will be there to handle everything you're seeing here with ease. So we introduce you to these tools so that you're not out there scavenging around with the little buyers out there who don't have a lot of resources, looking for sellers that have marginal companies and letting all the really good deals go to people who you think have a lot of money. They don't have a lot of money necessarily. They have a lot of brains in how they put their deals together. And we're trying to give you the brain portion here so that you have the opportunity to participate in the much better companies that are out there. And we use this technique to buy very high cash flow companies where there's almost no assets in the company, but their service businesses making money hand over fist. Next question. Love the structure, Gordon. Thank you very much. Question. Does the example assume the seller has 1.5 million in cash to place in escrow? No, it doesn't assume that at all, because what it assumes is that he's going to be getting $5,450,000 in this transaction, of which from that, he's going to allocate $1.5 million to be invested in BICO. The concept here is just very important. The seller's not coming up with any cash from outside the transaction. What are some of the responses you've gotten for sellers using this method? I'll tell you the most difficult one. The most difficult one is, okay, but if I sold my company for this price and I took back a note, that would be considered an installment purchase. And as an installment purchase, I don't pay tax on the portion that's covered by the note until I actually receive a payment on the note. So I'm only paying capital gain tax on the part that I got the cash for, whereas in this transaction, I'm going to have to pay capital gains on the whole transaction. So if I'm selling you the company for 5.45 million, I got to pay capital gains tax on whatever that is over my cost basis of the company. And then I have to give you $1.5 million of the cash back into the BICO, but I paid the capital gains on that $1.5 million. Whereas if you gave me a note for it, I wouldn't have had to pay the capital gains until I actually get my cash. There are many ways to handle that. One is you pay him a little more for the company. That covers the amount he has to pay in cash now. You work it so that the proportion of it that you're asking for is smaller, depending on how much of an asset-based loan you can arrange. In other words, there are many factors here, not the least of which we work with Tom Wheelwright, for example, where we come up with structures where the seller doesn't have to worry about that. He still won't have to pay the capital gains tax until he actually gets his cash. They're more sophisticated. They're a little tricky to actually put together, meaning they're sophisticated. It means you got to have people on the seller side where the seller wants to sell badly enough that they'll sit down with their attorney, their tax accountant, you and your tax accountant, and everybody will work through those challenges and be satisfied that it works. Okay, so you've got to have a motivated seller to go through all that. If your seller just believes, hey, I just put my business up for sale, somebody's going to write me a check and that's all I have to worry about. And if it's more complicated than that, I don't want to be involved. That's not your seller. Your seller has to be somebody who's motivated enough to sell. The dollars are big enough that they'll sit down with their attorney, their accountant, you, your attorney, your accountant, and work through all the tax ramifications of what the transaction actually means so that they get the right number of dollars in their pocket after tax when it is that they need to have them by. Next question. But the cash going in is not true equity, it's debt. No, it's not debt. The cash going into the second escrow is not debt. It doesn't appear as a liability on the balance sheet of BICO. It appears as equity. The money is from the purchase of shares. Now, the fact that we buy those seller shares back, we buy them back. And when we do, it's a reverse equity transaction. Whatever we use to pay him has to be deducted from the equity in the company's balance sheet item, okay? But there's no debt involved. It doesn't show up as debt anywhere. Okay, the next question. Won't the lender want to see that you have equity somewhere long before the closing? No, it's not the lender that wants to see that. It's the seller who traditionally wants to see that. In fact, it's usually the business broker who wants to see that because he wants to see that you have the cash somewhere to get his commission. Because if you don't pay him cash, then he's not going to get a commission somewhere. At least that's his belief. The broker and sometimes the seller want to know that you've got the cash to do the deal. But as far as the lender is concerned, they just want to know what the deal is. And they want to know when the escrow closes that X amount of cash is going to be coming in from the buyer to perform that portion of the deal. And it's especially true with mezzanine lenders. They really do not go beyond the money's coming in from you. All right. Gordon, I am a young entrepreneur. I'm currently working on a few acquisitions, one of which is generating 40 million a year in revenue and $1.5 million of EBITDA. I would like to have you involved. How can I reach out to you? How can I reach directly? Just call me. Just call me, 805-497-1000. And we'll talk about it. And if there's a way that I can help, I'll be glad to do it. We've had a dozen companies in escrow, raised all the needed money to close on all of them. And in each case, the seller got cold feet and walked. Any ideas, solutions to getting the seller to follow through with his contracts and show up at the closing? No, that's a great question. But here's what happens. Up until the time when you're in that letter of intent stage, they're not binding on anybody. You can walk away, the seller can walk away. What creates a binding agreement is what's called the definitive purchase agreement. And that's binding, which means if the seller walks away, they're subject to damages. And arguably, your damages are the value of the company you don't have. And my experience is it's very rare that a seller walks away after the signing of definitive agreement because it can get very expensive. And the real pain point for the seller is when he actually has to put his signature on the definitive agreement. When they're going to bulk, BALK, they are generally going to do it at that time. And after that, it's very difficult and expensive for them to do that. Can you take cash out of the deal at close? And the answer is yes, you can. Just like I said earlier, we could have $1 million left in the company. We could have had $1.1 million left in the company. $1 million goes in a bank deposit. The other 100,000 comes to you. Just to give you an example, it's in the company and there's nothing that says you can't pay it to yourself. Now, you may have some covenants with your lender, which say that the balance sheet has to have a certain amount of cash. The company has to have certain critical ratios that they maintain. All those things are part of perhaps your contract. So depending on how the lending agreement with the mezzanine lender or the bank, the answer is, as long as you're not violating those, there's cash that can be there that you can take out, pay yourself. Surely pay yourself a salary in working in the company. And to pay an extra amount of bonus or something like that is, as long as you keep it reasonable, it shouldn't be a problem. It's like the old adage on Wall Street, bulls and bears make money, pigs lose their shirt. The reason for all of that is you can get away with damn near anything if you keep it reasonable. If you get greedy, then somebody gets upset, and that's where the problem comes from. So if the amount you're including as compensation to yourself or as a bonus to yourself or whatever it is that you're doing, if you're modest about it, you shouldn't have any problem. If you get past modest, you could. Would you sue the sellers for breach of a binding asset purchase contract, not an LOI, or just let it go? That's a great question. That's a great question. And the reason I say it's a great question is in any lawsuit I've ever seen or been a part of, the only people that win are the lawyers. By the time you've invested the time, the money in the lawsuit, the aggravation, the distraction from other opportunities that you would have had you not pursued a lawsuit, when you start to look at the seen and unseen expenses of litigation, it's almost never worth it. Almost never. In my experience, the option is, unless I've been really severely damaged, I would be inclined to just shine it on and move on. That's me. But if I have been severely damaged, then there's just that ego part of me that says, I don't want to tolerate that, and I might. But the better sense of it is, as far as you can stay away from the legal system, the better off I think you are, because you can't win. You can't win. By the time you've done all of the expenses and factored in the stress, the emotional turmoil, the distraction from other positive things that you now won't have or won't get done because you're so tied up in emotionally, spiritually, intellectually with this lawsuit, it's just generally, I find them to be incredibly I'd rather just focus my energy on the positive, go out and do another deal. It's just that energy into that, and I'll put less time and energy into that and less expense into that, and I'll come out with just as good a profit as I had if I'd sued them. And I don't have any negative energy that goes into it. I don't have any ill feelings or sleepless nights, or call them whatever you want. Anything else that you want to ask in the way of questions today? We're going to be running out of time pretty soon. So hopefully we've answered everybody's question. Here's the way I see today's information. A lot of times people get stuck because they just don't know which way to go with something. And in the absence of a template, a form, they just stay stuck there. What I've tried to do here is to introduce you to an outside the box solution to a problem that business buyers run into all the time. And once you got this concept down, and once you got the elements down and clear, then the rest is just mechanics. And the mechanics may change from transaction to transaction. The deal that we use this template on for one company might be a little different in another company. A few of the elements get changed because they're not appropriate for that particular company. Certainly the amounts of money comes out differently. The percentages of the amount that has to be equity versus the amount that we're borrowing from a mezzanine lender will change. All of those things change. So the most important thing here is to get the concept. And then when you have the concept, in a specific opportunity in front of you, then with the concept as your template, you work through the mechanics of now what has to be true within that template in order for it to accommodate the transaction that you're now looking to put together. But without the template, without the map, without the concept map that you're going to be working from, it'll be very hard to do that because you don't know where to go with the pieces. So now, hopefully, you know where to go with the pieces. And now you'll take those individual pieces and put them together in a little unique way that then suits the transaction that you're trying to accomplish.